The dawn of Rome rose cold and silver that morning, the mist curling above the Tiber like incense rising toward heaven. The bells of St. Peter's began their slow peal before the sun had yet touched the dome. And across the city, pilgrims stirred from their straw beds, crossing themselves and whispering prayers. For it was the Lord's day, Christmas, but it was to be something far greater. A day whispered about in monasteries and halls. A day that would crown a new age. In the shadow of the Basilica, a tall figure dismounted his horse. His cloak was trimmed with sable. His hair and beard, once golden, were streaked with silver, and his blue eyes held both calm and command. Charles, Carolus Magnus, king of the Franks and Lombards, stood for a moment looking upon the city that had been the heart of empire long before his birth. Rome smelled of dust, frankincense, and power. His guards, mailed in iron, bowed slightly as he approached the basilica's steps. "Sire," one said softly, "His Holiness awaits." "I know," Charles replied. His voice carried the gravity of one who had ruled too long and seen too much. "And God awaits as well." He ascended the marble stairs, each footstep echoing. Within the basilica, thousands gathered, clergy in white vestments, nobles in silks, peasants and monks shoulder to shoulder. Candles flared along the nave, their smoke coiling into a golden haze beneath the high apse mosaic. Christ enthroned, offering his hand to the world. Pope Leo III stood before the altar, flanked by chanting deacons. His face was pale, his hands steady, though his heart pounded beneath his robes. He had summoned Charles not merely to honor the Nativity, but to seal the future of Christendom itself. Charles knelt at the altar, head bowed, sword sheathed beside him. He prayed in silence, not for glory, but for order. For years he had waged campaigns from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, carving unity from chaos. He had baptized Saxons by the sword, brought scholars to Aachen, and set laws upon parchment that spoke of peace through discipline. Yet in his heart he remained a man of war, uneasy with crowns and divine pretenses. As the choir's hymn swelled, Gloria in excelsis Deo, Leo stepped forward, the jeweled crown in his trembling hands. The air in the basilica seemed to tighten. Charles did not see the motion, only felt the weight descend upon his head, cool and heavy. The voice of the Pope rang out, "To Charles, most pious Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." The crowd erupted, voices crashing against the marble vaults like thunder. "Carolus Augustus, Carolus Imperator," they cried. Some wept, others fell to their knees. Even the Frankish knights, unaccustomed to such displays, clanged their swords upon their shields in salute. Charles rose, astonishment flickering across his features. He turned to Leo, his voice low but firm. "Had I known your intent," he murmured, "I would not have come to the Mass." But the Pope merely smiled, a weary, knowing smile. It was God's will, not mine. For a long moment the two men regarded each other, the warrior and the priest, the sword and the crozier. Beyond them, the people shouted and sang, believing they witnessed not just a coronation, but the rebirth of Rome itself. And perhaps they did. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's rang again, louder now, carrying across the Tiber, over the ruins of Caesar's Forum, through the Seven Hills. The city that had once fallen to barbarians now crowned a barbarian as its emperor. History itself seemed to circle back upon its origin. Charles descended the steps once more, the winter sunlight gleaming on the new crown. His horse pawed the stones impatiently, its breath steaming in the air. He looked toward the horizon, where the road led back to Aachen, his northern capital, the heart of his empire. "A new Rome," he murmured, "but not the old one." He mounted and rode through the cheering crowds, through the gates of a city reborn in ceremony. Yet deep within, he wondered if power bestowed by priestly hands could ever rival that forged by the sword. The coronation was done. The age of emperors had begun anew. The journey northward from Rome was slow and solemn. The winter rains had turned the Via Flaminia into a mire, and the imperial procession, banners heavy with moisture, hooves splashing through puddles, seemed less a triumphal return than a quiet exodus. Yet Charlemagne rode at the head, his gaze fixed upon the road ahead, as if the future itself waited somewhere beyond the mist. Behind him rode bishops, abbots, and counts, men who spoke in low tones of what had happened. To some, the coronation was divine providence, the final confirmation that Charles was chosen by God to unite Christendom. To others, it was a dangerous presumption, a claim that might awaken the long, silent wrath of Constantinople. For there already sat an emperor, Irene, the Empress of the East, who ruled in the name of Rome. When night fell, the retinue made camp near a cluster of ruined villas. Fires flickered in the rain. Charles sat apart beneath a tattered awning, his cloak wrapped tightly around him. Einhard, his scholar and scribe, approached with parchment in hand. "Sire," Einhard began hesitantly, "word will spread quickly. The Greeks will not be pleased, nor will some of the Saxon lords. But your name, your title, will echo across all Christendom." Charles poked the fire with a stick, sending up a spurt of sparks. "Titles echo," he said quietly, "but echoes fade." Einhard lowered his gaze. "Yet Rome crowned you, and that will not fade. You have given the Church protection. In turn, the Church gives you eternity." The king, no, the emperor, smiled faintly. "Eternity is a word for monks and poets. I will settle for peace." His thoughts drifted as the night deepened. He remembered his campaigns, the burning forests of Saxony, the broken walls of Pavia, the stubborn defiance of the Avars. He had fought to bring order, yes, but the sword had a way of creating only quiet, not peace. Now the crown weighed heavier than any armor he had worn. The next morning they rode through the Umbrian hills. Peasants emerged from cottages to watch the glittering column pass. Some knelt, others crossed themselves. Children called out "Imperator" and scattered flowers before the horses. The title still felt foreign to Charles's ears, Roman, ancient, alien. By the time they reached Ravenna, the imperial messengers had already arrived from the east. The Empress Irene's court had heard of the coronation and sent word, cold, curt, and distant. The message was read aloud by Alcuin, the old English scholar who had long served as Charles's advisor. "Her Imperial Majesty," Alcuin said, squinting at the script, "declares that Rome has but one emperor ordained by God. She recognizes not the claim of the Frankish king." Charles said nothing. He took the parchment, rolled it slowly, and placed it beside the fire. The flames licked at the edges until the wax seal melted and fell away. "I have no quarrel with her," he said at last. "Let her keep the east. I will keep the west. The Lord's vineyard is vast enough for 2 stewards." Alcuin sighed. "And yet," he said softly, "history does not always share so kindly." The emperor looked out toward the darkening sea. "Then we shall make our own history." By spring, Charles was back in Aachen, his beloved palace city. Steam rose from the great baths. Scholars filled the library, and artisans worked on mosaics meant to rival those of Ravenna and Rome. The empire was a living thing, half Roman dream, half Frankish iron. On Easter, he entered the chapel wearing a simple tunic, the imperial crown left behind in his chambers. There was no pomp this time, only a prayer. Yet as the choir sang, his eyes turned upward to the octagonal dome above, where the light poured down like grace itself. He thought of Leo in Rome, trembling as he placed the crown upon his head. He thought of the soldiers buried in foreign soil, of the laws he had written, of the sons who would one day inherit a world both fragile and grand. And in that light, Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, Emperor of the Romans, closed his eyes and whispered a prayer not for empire but for wisdom, for he knew, as few rulers did, that the weight of a crown was less in its gold than in the silence it demanded afterward. The years that followed the coronation were both golden and shadowed. In Aachen, the new imperial court blossomed. Scholars from every corner of Christendom, Irish monks, Italian clerics, Frankish poets, flocked to Charlemagne's Palladium. They brought with them books rescued from crumbling monasteries, parchment covered with the wisdom of Greeks and Romans. The air of the palace smelled of ink and wax, of wet parchment and burning oil. It was here that the emperor dreamed of restoring not only Rome's power, but its learning. At night he walked the colonnades of his chapel, its octagonal dome glimmering in the lamplight, its mosaics depicting Christ enthroned in majesty. Alcuin once found him there, gazing upward, fingers tracing the carved marble as though reading a sacred script. "You would rebuild Rome from letters and prayer," the scholar said softly. Charlemagne smiled. "A sword can win a kingdom," he replied, "but it takes a pen to keep it." He established schools, decreed that every monastery must teach a reading and writing, and sent clerics through the provinces to gather the wisdom of old. The people began to call it a renaissance. Though the word had not yet been invented, a rebirth of order after centuries of darkness. Yet beneath the harmony, fissures deepened. The empire was vast, stitched together by oaths, marriages, and faith, but it was also fragile. Saxon tribes still smoldered under forced baptism. The Lombard dukes grumbled at Frankish rule. Even among his sons, ambition simmered. Pepin of Italy dreamed of independence. Louis of Aquitaine sought holiness, and Charles the Younger coveted command. In council one autumn morning, the emperor sat in silence as his advisors argued over borders and heirs. When their voices rose, he struck the table with his fist. "Enough!" he thundered. "Have we built this empire only to divide it before I die?" The room fell still. The fire hissed in the hearth. He looked from one son to the other. "You will inherit my burden, not my crown," he said, "and God help whichever of you forgets that they are one and the same." Afterward, he walked alone in the courtyard. The first frost had touched the grass, and a single raven perched on the chapel roof, black against the gray sky. He watched it for a long time, then murmured, "Even the birds know when winter comes." In the winter of 804, messengers arrived from the Elbe. The Saxons had rebelled again, burning churches and killing priests. Old wounds reopened. Charlemagne rode north one last time, though age had begun to slow his step and silvered his beard. The campaign was swift, brutal, and weary. When he returned to Aachen, he carried not spoils, but ashes. He forbade further vengeance, commanding instead that the Saxon lands be rebuilt, their people reconciled through peace rather than terror. That night, by the great hearth, he confided to Einhard, "I once thought God's favor lay in conquest. Now I know it lies in restraint." Einhard bowed his head. "History will remember your wisdom, sire." Charlemagne's gaze softened. "History remembers nothing without scribes," he said with a faint smile. As the years turned, his body weakened, but his mind remained sharp. In the mornings, he attended Mass. In the evenings, he dictated laws, speaking slowly so that his secretaries could record each word in Latin. He slept little. The empire he had forged through war now demanded his patience in peace. Sometimes he would open the chest beside his bed and lift the imperial crown, its gold dimmed, its jewels dulled by candlelight. He would hold it in both hands, studying the workmanship, the way it caught even the faintest flicker of flame. "Rome gave this to me," he whispered once to Alcuin, "but no man can wear two crowns, the one of gold and the one of thorns, without bleeding." Alcuin, old and nearly blind, murmured, "Perhaps that is the price of empire." Charlemagne nodded slowly. "Then may God forgive the one who pays it." In his final years, pilgrims from across Christendom came to Aachen, peasants seeking blessings, monks bearing relics, nobles swearing fealty. They came not to the conqueror, but to the patriarch of Europe. His presence inspired awe, not fear. He spoke less of war and more of unity, urging his bishops to tend the hearts of men as he once tended their borders. And when ambassadors came from the Byzantine court, bearing silks and olive branches, he accepted peace without pride. The dream of a single Christian empire, east and west, flickered for a moment in the cold northern light. On the last Christmas of his life, he attended Mass in the same chapel where he had so often prayed. The hymns rose like incense, filling the great dome. As the choir sang Gloria in Excelsis Deo, he closed his eyes, feeling the echo of that first coronation in Rome so many years before. The empire endured, and the man who had forged it at sword's edge, who had united kings and priests beneath one cross, bowed his head, not as an emperor but as a servant of the God who had crowned him. In the early months of 814, the snows came thick across the Rhineland. The roads were buried, the rivers frozen, and Aachen lay cloaked in white silence. Smoke curled gently from the palace roofs, rising into the pale sky like ghostly banners. Inside, fires blazed in every hearth, yet the great hall felt cold, an echo of its master's waning strength. Charlemagne's health had faltered through the winter. The physicians brought herbs and draughts of honeyed wine. Priests prayed by his bedside, their chants a low murmur against the howl of the wind. Yet the emperor himself seemed calm, almost detached from the body that betrayed him. He still rose each morning, wrapped in furs, to sit by the window overlooking the courtyard. There he would watch the snow fall upon the chapel dome, its marble softened to white, and the sight would bring a faint, wistful smile. Einhard entered quietly one morning, parchment tucked beneath his arm. "Majesty," he said, "the scribes have completed the new codex of laws you dictated. Shall I read it to you?" Charlemagne shook his head. "Not now." "Leave it on the table. There will be time for reading in heaven, I think." Einhard's eyes glistened, but he did not argue. He placed the parchment down and lingered. "You should rest, sire." "Rest?" Charlemagne chuckled softly. "I have rested little these 70 winters. Why begin now?" His laughter faded, replaced by a look of quiet reflection. "Tell me, Einhard, do they still speak of the coronation?" "Everywhere," the scholar replied. "They call it the day Rome was reborn." The emperor's gaze drifted to the chapel once more. "Reborn, perhaps," he murmured, "but not renewed. The heart of man does not change with crowns or altars. It changes only with faith." He paused, his breath shallow. "I fear I built my empire of stones when God would have me build with souls." Einhard knelt beside him. "You built both, Majesty. You brought order where there was chaos. You gave learning to the ignorant, law to the wild, and hope to the fearful. That is no small miracle." Charlemagne placed a trembling hand on the scribe's shoulder. "Then may God forgive the rest." 3 days later, as the feast of St. Agnes approached, his fever rose. Priests came to anoint him with holy oil, murmuring the rites of the dying. He received the Eucharist in silence, eyes half closed, lips moving in prayer. The crown lay untouched at the foot of his bed, beside his sword. In the final hours of night, when the candles burned low, he called for his son, Louis. The young man entered, broad-shouldered, grave, his eyes uncertain beneath the weight of inheritance. He knelt beside the bed. "My son," Charlemagne said weakly, "you will rule after me. Remember this, the empire is not yours. It is God's, and you are but its keeper." Louis nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will, father." Charlemagne's hand moved feebly toward the crown. "Take it," he whispered, "and wear it lightly." Louis hesitated, then obeyed, lifting the golden circlet into his hands. "Do not let its weight make you proud," the emperor continued. "The world will call you great, but greatness is a fleeting guest. Seek wisdom instead, and the Lord will not depart from your house." His voice faltered. He looked once more toward the chapel window, where faint dawn light had begun to glow. "The sun rises," he murmured, "and the Lord calls." Then, with a breath as soft as prayer, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, emperor of the Romans, father of Europe, closed his eyes. At the hour of tierce, the bells of Aachen tolled. Their sound rolled across the snowy fields, carrying the news to every cloister and village. The emperor was dead. Monks wept openly. Soldiers bowed their heads. In the chapel, his body lay in state, draped in purple, the sword joyeuse at his side, the gospel open upon his chest. Pilgrims came from every corner of the realm to pay their respects, kneeling before the man who had been more myth than mortal. Einhard recorded every detail, the garments, the prayers, the solemn faces. Yet even as he wrote, he felt the weight of history pressing upon his quill. He knew that what ended here was not merely a life, but an age. On the day of burial, the sky was clear, the air still. Louis and his court processed into the chapel, torches casting long shadows on the marble floor. The tomb was a stone sarcophagus, plain yet dignified, set beneath the great dome. When the last hymn faded, Louis placed his father's crown upon the altar and whispered, "May God guard your soul and the empire you built." The doors closed. The bells rang once more. And so passed Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, whose dream had bound together the broken lands of the West, whose legacy would echo through 1,000 years as the Holy Roman Empire. Outside, the snow began again, falling softly upon Aachen, upon the chapel, the city, and the empire that had risen and would one day fall. But for that moment, beneath heaven's silence, the world belonged to the memory of a single man who had dared to call himself emperor.